Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. The question I want to deal with in today's video is whether Buddhists believe in sin. I think many people are drawn to Buddhism because they feel as though it doesn't have anything to do with this division between sin and holiness that we find in many Western religions. So that's going to be the topic of today's video. If you're new to these videos of mine and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So in today's video, what I want to deal with is this question of sin, of whether or not Buddhists believe in sin. Now, to get at that question, we first have to look at what sin is. What does sin mean? Because I think a lot of these discussions about sin tend to sort of not really look at that too deeply, and so miss a lot of the nuance here, and what I think is really important. I mean, my background is in philosophy. I've done some philosophy of religion, and I'm sort of interested in these kinds of questions. So we'll spend a little bit of time with that, looking at sort of the biblical origins of at least a Western conception of sin. And then we'll turn to some of the Buddhist, how Buddhism relates to these ideas. So to begin with, what exactly is a sin? Well, a sin is some act that transgresses divine law. And that's relatively simple. But it's deceptively simple, shall we say. What is divine law? Well, it's a law that is given to us by some God, by some all-powerful, all-knowing, supposedly perfectly good creator of the world, something like that. That's the sort of Western theological conception of what a divine law might be. So it's a kind of ethics by divine command, that there is a certain person in the world whose commands we must follow. And to counteract those commands, or to go against those commands, well, that's wrong. That's sinful. This is one of the ideas behind the conception of sin. Now, but it's more than just about the person that gives us the law. There's also a conception of what the law is, the character of that law. Now, when we think of concepts like sin, probably what comes to mind for many of us are the Ten Commandments. And if we look at those Ten Commandments, particularly the first few of them, what we find are a number of, again, divine commands, commandments, commands from supposedly a God, that are, I would say, explicitly sectarian in character. That is, they're religious in their character. They express what in the commandments themselves is described as a jealous God. Now, I'm not going to go into all the commandments here, and in fact, I'm not going to go into any of the commandments in detail. That would really be subject for an enormous number of videos, because there's actually quite a lot to say about them. However, what I do want to do is to put up here on the screen the first, roughly speaking, 4 commandments. I say roughly because the commandments themselves aren't numbered, and they can be numbered in different ways. But in any event, for our purposes, we'll say the first 4 commandments, and we'll put them up here on the screen. And I'm not going to, as I say, not going to go into them in detail, but there are a number of things that we can see about them. The first commandment is that you can only have one God, that no other God should be before that God. The second one, that you shouldn't make yourself an image of anything. And then the corollary of that you shouldn't bow down to or worship those images, because it says explicitly, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents. So this is part of the punishment that's involved in this kind of action of sin. That you shouldn't misuse the name of the God, and that you should remember the Sabbath day, which is actually Saturday, by keeping it holy. These are the expressions that we find in the first 4 commandments. Now I want to underline the fact that these are the first commandments, because the commandments in the Bible are ordered essentially in terms of importance. That is, the first commandment is the most important, the second is the second most important, and down from there. So what we have here in Western theology is a notion of divine command that presents us with, again, a very sectarian idea of what it is to sin. That sin is bound up in our religious identity, in our religious practices. That what we have to do is to propitiate a jealous God. And that if we fail to do that, that we are in a grave danger of being punished by that God because that God is jealous. Now, it's important also to keep in mind that there are later commandments within the 10 Commandments that are more akin to what we might find in Buddhism. Things like, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. But those are the more minor commandments, at least compared with the first 4, because they come later down in the list. They're not considered as important as the religious ones. Now, coming from the point of view of somebody from the outside, we look at this list and we wonder what the big deal is. Why shouldn't we have any other gods? Why shouldn't we make images of things? Why shouldn't we work on Saturday? None of these seem to make much sense. And the argument from within the commandments themselves is that if you do them, you're going to be punished. You're going to be essentially punished by a jealous God down to our descendants, second or third descendants, whatever, children and children's children. So it's an issue of power, essentially, that we're dealing with a being, a jealous being, that has the power to cause us great suffering. And so for that reason alone, we should follow what this person says. Now, many of us find such a view, in particular a view of sin, to be distasteful. We don't like this sort of bullying kind of tone, where the things that we were being asked to do don't make any real sense to us, and we're told we have to do them or we're going to be punished. Very few people, if any, really follow all of these. Very few people follow the commandment not to make images. Very few people follow the commandment not to work on a Saturday. I should stress that the Sabbath day is Saturday, not Sunday. So the whole thing is a little bit strange, coming as an outsider. Okay, well now with that as the background about what sin is and where it comes from, where some of our ideas of sin come from, then we should turn to what Buddhism has to say about these kinds of things. Well, to begin with, most forms of Buddhism don't really have an idea of there being a God in the sense that we find in Western religion. I did a video about this in the past on whether or not Buddhism can be seen as atheist, and I'll put a link to that down below. The general answer there is that it's complicated, because Buddhism traditionally does assert the existence of gods plural. And in that sense, we might say Buddhism is not atheist. It says that there are gods. However, within Buddhism, the gods are seen as essentially mortal beings, that they don't live forever. They're not perfectly good. They're not all-powerful, and they're not all-knowing. Indeed, famously in the early suttas, the gods in general are portrayed as being ignorant, as being arrogant and ignorant. And the Buddha himself is not seen as a god, certainly not in the early tradition and in certain other traditions as well. Rather, he is described as being a teacher of gods and men. That is to say, not only does he teach people, but he also teaches the gods. That is to say, the gods, who are themselves ignorant about wisdom, come to the Buddha to learn from him in certain of the early texts. Now, there are later schools of Buddhism that take the Buddha to be essentially godlike in many respects. However, even so, the Buddha is not a lawgiver in the biblical sense. The Buddha doesn't create the law or enforce the law. Rather, the Buddha is simply a being of some great metaphysical importance. Further, in Buddhism, there's no room for the Buddha to be a jealous God. Jealousy is expressly described in one early text as one of the corruptions of the mind. And this kind of view of jealousy is something that I think is inherent to all forms of Buddhism with which I'm familiar, and at any rate, that jealousy is a kind of a corruption, and that anyone who is enlightened, such as the Buddhas, anyone who has reached Buddhahood for sure, has left such corruptive mental states as jealousy behind. So whatever sort of a being the Buddha is, he's not a jealous one. Further, the Buddha does not lay down the moral law. Now, in India, at the time of the Buddha's life, and indeed down to the present day, ethics was seen as part of the fabric of reality. It's what we call karma. And karma is something that was impersonal. It did not depend upon there being a God to enforce it. So one example we might give is that when we throw a ball up in the air, we're guaranteed to have it come back down to us. In the same way, when we commit to an action, when we intend and carry through an action, we're going to inevitably have the blowback of that reaction, of that action of ours. We're going to have, if we do something positive in the world, we are, at least on the Indian idea of karma, guaranteed to have a positive result come back to us eventually, and so too with negative. If we do some harm to others, we're going to have blowback in terms of harm to ourselves eventually. And just as if you throw a ball up in the air, it doesn't require there to be some being that forces the ball to come back down. It simply comes back down in accordance with natural laws. So too in ancient India and in ancient Buddhism and modern Buddhism, it's believed that the moral law operates in the same way. That is, that karma is simply a feature of the universe, that if we create harm to others, harm will come back to us. If we benefit others, then benefit will come back to us. And there's no need for some sort of supreme godlike being to enforce this law. So in that sense, morality is not some group of commandments that were given by a jealous being out of concern to hold on to their power or to exercise their power in support of their own jealous mental states. But rather, morality is simply a feature of doing benefit or harm to others. That if we benefit them, we're going to find benefit for ourselves. And if we do great benefit, we'll have great benefit back. Small benefit, we'll have small benefit. You get the point. Now, the question then is this a divine law in some sense that I've just described? Does karma qualify then as a divine law? Well, I would say yes and no. Again, the case is somewhat nuanced. As you've heard in so many of my videos, it's easy to say, to give a specific, straightforward answer, but that wouldn't be really accurate. In certain ways it is, and in certain ways it isn't. It certainly isn't a divine law in that, as we've seen, it's not karma is not laid down or enforced by any kind of divine being. While there are indeed what we call in Buddhism the 5 precepts, which are rules for living that really in many ways mirror similar rules later on in the 10 Commandments, such as don't kill, don't steal, don't commit sexual misconduct, don't lie. These in Buddhism are given more as practical advice, as advice to practice, to keep in mind so as not to harm other people, so as not to gain bad karma. However, the 5 precepts are not in any way commandments from a divine being, and so we have to think of them in different ways. And in that sense, the karma that we find in Buddhism, bad karma, is not a sin in the same sense that we find in the West. However, there is a sense in which karma is a kind of divine law. Now, what sense is that? Well, the sense is that you can't escape it. In other words, if you do great harm in the world, you're not going to escape getting some kind of blowback for that. And again, if you do great good in the world, you won't be able to escape gaining positive effects in the future. That's at least in the view in Buddhism, and indeed in so far as I know, most Indian religions. So it is a kind of a divine law in the sense that it's not escapable. It's simply a feature of reality. So, for example, we have the case of Angulimala in early Buddhism. Angulimala was a mass murderer who eventually decided to give up his murderous ways and join the Sangha, and eventually he became enlightened. I did an earlier video about him, and I'll leave a link to that down below. But for the purposes of this video, the point with him is that he, even after he became very well adept and was a monastic for a while, he had to put up with abuse from the villagers that he would go to beg for food, because the villagers knew that he had been a murderer and perhaps had even killed people that they knew. And so they would throw things at him, they would abuse him verbally and physically. And when this would happen, the Buddha would say to him, you know, that, look, this is your karmic consequence for having done these things. You can't escape that karma. Now, you might think to yourself, well, not everybody who does bad things is punished for them, and the same with doing good things. Not everyone who does good things reaps the benefit. That certainly is true within one particular life. In traditional Buddhism, as many of us will know, there's the idea that we have future lives and we had past lives, that we are reborn into a future life, and so therefore whatever karmic baggage we have may ripen for us sometime in a future life. And indeed in traditional Buddhism, and this goes way back to the beginning, there is indeed an idea of heavens and hells. And these heavens and hells are described to an extent in the early tradition, and again all through into the later traditions. And these descriptions in many ways mirror the descriptions of heavens and hells that we find in Western religions as well. That hells are places of great torture and punishment, and heavens are places of great enjoyment and pleasure. However, the distinction between heavens and hells in Buddhism and those in the West is that the heavens and hells in Buddhism are impermanent, that we're not permanently anywhere, that we move around between them based on our karmic baggage. And so therefore, if we go to hell, it will be hell for a period of time, but not forever. Eventually we will extinguish whatever karmic seeds put us there, and then we will perhaps move up to other more pleasant places. So there are indeed some similarities with ideas that we find in Western religion associated with sin. But again, sin as such I don't think we find in Buddhism, once we understand that sin to be essentially related to the commandments of a jealous God. If you want to hear more about these realms of Buddhism, which can be understood literally, or I think can be understood, to me makes more sense to understand them more figuratively as metaphors that we live in our day-to-day lives, I did an earlier video about that, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and seeing if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much to all of you, and we'll catch you on the next video.